Hello, I'm Toycat and welcome back to the second channel video. So when you look at a map of the world, at least a traditional one, it becomes very clear very quickly that every single part of the Earth has been claimed by one of the countries on it. I mean, sure, there are some weird exceptions like Svalbard, which is a part of Norway, but also sort of not. Sure, there are places like Antarctica, where lots of different countries make individual claims to slices off the, the continent, but also every country signed a treaty saying that it sort of belongs to everyone. Sure, there are places where multiple countries disagree about who owns a part of land, and even the exact opposite, where two countries both think that each other owns the part of the land, which is a real thing between Egypt and Sam, by the way. But the interesting thing is that everyone agrees that all of the land on Earth pretty much has been claimed, and therefore, Earth is done and space is the new frontier for humanity, right? But the truth is actually kind of the opposite, because although this is what a map of the world usually looks like, a map of the world really should look like this, because fun fact, did you know over 70% of the Earth's surface is water, and water and, sea and oceans are really the untamed resource that we're still getting a grip on even in the 21st century, and it's something I wanted to talk about because, again, even though this looks like a map that a child kind of drew on, the reality is, maybe this is a more accurate map that kind of shows that, yeah, countries own different amounts of the Earth than you might think they do because of the UN agreements we've come to over just the last 100 years or so, because, again, it really didn't matter for the longest time till then, and it's something I wanted to talk about in today's video because it kind of ties into an interesting sponsorship offer I've received, because this video is brought to you by World of Warships. That's right, how do you patrol and defend your exclusive economic zones? You do so using a warship. So if you don't already know, World of Warships is the free-to-play PC game which allows you to command some of history's most iconic vessels. There are over 300 ships in classes like destroyer, cruiser, battleship, or carrier. You can command pretty much any major ship that you can think of, and every single one of these is amazingly detailed. And the reason for this is because, I learned this fact kind of recently, but the development studio is based in St. Petersburg, a city with huge naval history, as you can imagine, given its naval importance to Russia. That's even why they tried to locate their capital there for a bit. But this, the studio has a huge commitment to, making sure that they're historically accurate and detailed, and they spent about 6 months from start to finish to make sure every single ship is accurate because they're history nerds as well as enjoying the kind of war sense of the game. And so, yeah, if you want to join me in battle, if you want to join me on the, what would you call like the battlefield, but for ships? If you want to join me on the battle sea, then you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can use the code READYFORBATTLE2020, and the rewards for using the code are 700 doubloons, 1 million credits, a 7 days premium account, a premium ship, the USS Charleston with stars and stripe camouflage, and the premium Japanese ship, the Ishizuchi. And I'm gonna be honest, I'd use the code too, even though this is my campaign, because I want the freebies as well. But yeah, you can do so, and you can check out the game using the link down below. Thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to the video though. Anyway though, let's get back into the video and let's talk about how this will affect the future of everything, the future of the world and conflicts and stuff like that, because there are a lot of key conflicts that aren't going to happen over land and who owns that, because although there are some dicey situations, it's mostly agreed, but most of the future is going to be, like fights over the parts of the world which still are unclaimed, which, as you can see, even with the most liberal definitions of who owns what parts of the sea, there are still huge swaths of it that are unclaimed that no doubt have huge resources underneath or above them that people do like to get. But anyway, with that said, let's talk about how exactly countries can own the sea, because how can you even own the sea, man? I mean, it's also really weird when you get like countries like the UK, which are all over the place, which is a thing you can probably work out the reason behind, but we'll get more into that later. But first of all, let's explain how this is possible, because over the last 100 years, UN agreements have kind of, explained something that looks a little bit like this, because historically speaking, there is like 5 ways to divide the land. The first one, again, it's mostly historically speaking, there are a few countries that still use this definition today, but 3 miles away from land was where a lot of countries, including the British Empire, when it was the biggest country on Earth, used to use to kind of delineate what was their part of the water and what used to be international past that. 3 miles was chosen because it was how far a cannon could be thrown, could be fired from land, and I kind of find that to be funny that, like, oh yeah, 3 miles, that belongs to us, and you can go anywhere you want. As long as we can't fire a cannon at you, then I guess you can go there freely. Like, that was kind of the British Empire's attitude towards things, and a lot of countries followed that as their standard. However, in modern times, 12 miles is the distance from a country where the water belongs wholly and exclusively to that country. Sure, any merchant ship, any trading ship, any innocent passage ship, a ship with innocent intentions can go through there, but in reality, this is militarily and also economically controlled by the host country, with another 12 miles beyond that, the contiguous zone, which can be used for military reasons to help control those 12 miles. That's the 12 miles you have the right to, and then the UN agrees that you get an extra 12 miles to kind of patrol extra and be like, hey, don't come within our 12 miles and we're going to go a 12 miles further out to kind of defend that. It's a weird concept, but it does exist. And then the UN agreed as of about 50 years ago that actually 200 miles out from shore, that is something that belongs to a country also, but only sort of. The water above it is passageway for everyone, because if you agreed that 200 miles from every country was belonging to it and they could charge trade rights for it, etc, 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 then if we look at the map of the world like this, you could see how, like, oh yeah, passage, across Canada and the northern, thing would be impossible. Passage across lots of parts of the world would become much more tricky because you'd have to avoid going through lots of countries' waters. So yeah, it's kind of agreed that, like, hey, 200 miles is your exclusive economic zone. You don't own the rights to the water, but you own the rights to the economic activity within it. Or you have exclusive economic rights within the zone, you could say, the EEZ. This is the most commonly used definition. However, if you exist in a country which has a continental shelf, which looks something a bit like this, by the way, if your country is one of the ones that has that, and lots of countries are, then you get 350 miles where you don't own the sea, you don't own the rights to the sea, but you do own the rights to what's below the ground, what's below the continental shelf, and those are the 4 different ways, or 5 really, we can define where water belongs. And you might think, like, man, that is overly complex, but it is importantly over complex because it does lead, because again, economic activity is the thing that drives humans and the competition between countries, and it leads to lots of interesting borders between countries like this one, because most countries, especially ones with nations nearby them, do claim the full 200 miles as their exclusive economic zone, and it leads to weird borders like this where, like, oh yeah, if 2 countries obviously can't go 200 miles each, then what ends up happening instead is the border is drawn halfway between them, and you can see the weird situation it leads to, like, oh yeah, because the UK has Northern Ireland and Rockall and the Faroe Islands, like, because of the weird, sets of islands that the UK does own, there are weird situations like this where this is kind of the UK's border. In terms of area the UK owns the exclusive economic rights to, including oil and fish, etc., this is what the UK owns, which is surprisingly advantageous, except wait a minute, doesn't the UK own a lot more than that? And the answer is yes, actually. The UK owns a lot of land all over the world, as you can see from these UK things right here. It's actually easier to see them, in my opinion, based on the British flags that are just spread all over around the world, and long story short, because, the historic parts of the empire which don't want to leave the UK just yet, yeah, that's why there's a lot of fishing waters which are owned by a lot of fishing, and also oil waters which are owned by the UK and actually could become very tactical. It's interesting, having a lot of land around the world for the most part doesn't provide too much value, I mean, beyond like tax havens and all the other weird things like that, but they do provide a lot of sea access which will become very important in the future, because even you might be thinking, like, how is sea access really that important? I mean, sure, finding oil below it, that's a big thing, and that's a huge thing, by the way. Oil, has made the riches of some of the countries around here, and it hasn't made the riches of others, but I'm, again, pointing to Scotland, pointing to Norway, but the interesting thing, maybe you could say the UK had the oil, or rather, I guess to be more precise, the Shetland Isles really benefited from the oil, and the UK as a whole got mild benefits from the oil, and then Norway has, of course, ridiculous benefits from their oil, right? There are lots of countries that have hugely benefited from oils, but even leaving that to the side, the other interesting one is fishing, because this border right here actually came about, the reason the UN had to kind of agree where borders were was because Iceland wanted to have a much deeper, Iceland's a very fishing-based economy, only 300,000 people live there, but they have a huge reliance on fish. It's even on their currency, fun fact. But yeah, basically, Norway is Iceland is a country that is heavily reliant on fish. Norway is too, but Iceland is a country that's heavily reliant on fish. And as a result, when UK fishermen who wanted cod, because fish and chips uses cod, fun fact, and lots of other things, but they wanted cod, they came over to what Iceland considered their waters and what the UK considered theirs. This actually led to the Cod Wars, which is the most amusing kind of like war in history that technically was a war because the UK sent Royal Navy ships over and the Iceland sent their Coast Guard, and there were some disputes such as ramming off boats, but yeah, it's a war where a country 200 times smaller than the UK actually managed to win a war against the UK, and I love it because it wasn't just one war, it was a series of Cod Wars, all of which Iceland won. Again, it's a beautiful thing to hear when a country like Iceland can just like, major established, fifth, largest military and whatever else, major world power. Nah, we want fish this bad, we're gonna fight a war, and they're gonna win it, which again, give some points to Iceland for that, if nothing else. So yeah, with that said, that is why that's important. There are friendly wars like that, but you can imagine there's going to be much less friendly wars elsewhere in the world, and this is why this is so important, because, you know, first of all, there are places like, I don't know, the South China Sea. Did you know this is a huge dispute in the world? Because in Southeast Asia, there is a huge density of countries kind of around here. I mean, there's Singapore, there's Indonesia, there's Philippines, there's Vietnam, and then there's China over here, and there's a sea which they all, again, they need to use to get goods between them. The key ports in places like Hong Kong and Shanghai and I forget the name of the city, but it's on the other side of the Hong Kong border, Shenzhen, and all of these other huge ports, obviously Singapore, all of these major countries need shipping. It's a key part of Asian economies, especially right now, and as a result of that, China claims this sea belongs to them. I mean, it's called the South China Sea. I mean, it's pretty reasonable to assume it's theirs, whereas, you know, all the other countries in the region claim their UN, you know, required thing, and sadly, this is one of those areas where, like, oh yeah, even though they all claim that, even though maybe that's how that should be, China's just like, oh yeah, this is roughly what we own. They don't. The funny thing is, it's called the 9- line. It's sometimes the 10 or the 11- line. If you count right here, because Taiwan's included, it's actually 10 dashes. But the interesting thing is, it's called the 9- line. China doesn't even make precise claims to the area. They just go, that's roughly what we own. Everything in there, that's us. And they also make a lot of fake islands in there to help with their claim. But it means that there are sometimes cases where 5 separate areas all claim they are the rightful owner to the same place. The Spratly Islands being a key example. Even with the least of the crazy claims, with like the Paracel Islands, there's 3 separate countries all making claim to them. It gets a little ridiculous very quickly because lots of countries all have exclusive economic zones, which they believe slightly overlap with each other. Again, because every country's kind of drawn their own boundaries, you can see how, like, oh yeah, what's this? Malaysia and Vietnam got a border dispute. Also, China's in on there. What's that? Brunei and also Vietnam and also China and also Malaysia and also almost touching the Philippines all believe they claim these tiny little stretches. There are these huge overlaps between what countries control, and you know what makes it even more confusing? The fact that the UN has basically said, hey, you know, again, in its usual way, like, this isn't a thing you can do, China. That's not a real thing. And it's not just, you know, China that's unhappy with that. It's also Taiwan, because Taiwan, you know, again, Taiwan, actually, surprisingly enough, here's a fun fact I learned while diving into this. Taiwan makes several claims to the area as well, not just because it claims to be China. Again, Taiwan is actually officially called the Republic of China. They technically have to say that they have ownership rights over anything that is China because of... It's weird things where China wants Taiwan to say that they own China so they can both claim to be the one legitimate state. But the interesting thing about this is if you look into it, you can see that Taiwan actually owns 2 of these islands themselves. Most of these islands are Chinese-made or Chinese-occupied or something like that. But Dongsha Island, right over here, which is the largest in the you know, island chain to the north, it's even a national park for Taiwan. Guess what? This belongs to Taiwan. Also, surprisingly enough to me at least, Taiping Island, which is just the north of that, also to the south of that. It's actually one of the, it's the biggest in the Spratly Islands. This is something that belongs to Taiwan as well, because they signed the peace treaty with Japan, and also Japan had a settlement garrison there. And basically as a result of that, Taiwan owns one of the most strategic islands in this strait that China wants, but also the Philippines, also Malaysia and Vietnam all have separate different claims to. It's a huge mess that, again, is always kind of leading to a thing right there. And it's funny because the way this is kind of dealt with is the US just kind of sails their, you know, like their ships through the area being like, hey, we can do this, but trying to assert that, like, well, this is international territory, and China's like, that's our territory, you're sailing your big battleships through. It's the weirdest, like, petty game that potentially could lead to a war at any moment, and isn't that fun? I think that's beautifully fun. I don't know what else, I don't know what you're talking about right there. But yeah, the Southeast Asia is a big minefield because of this sort of stuff, and you might be thinking, like, okay, so you're gonna pick on, you know, like, the area for that, and I kind of think it's like, it's not, again, I think it's something that every country in the region has its own reason for fighting for. I think China obviously has unfair claims in that way, but just in case this is one of those videos where it's like, oh, so you're not gonna, you know, let the US get away with what they're doing. Here's the interesting thing when it comes to geopolitics and it comes to the US and kind of their position on this, because a lot of people think the US has an unfair deal with the world. I hear this a lot. It's a very, again, both of the major presidential candidates in the United States right now, again, the Bernie Sanders of the world and the Donald Trumps of the world, are both like, wow, the US gets an unfair deal every time we sign international agreements. Again, we've got two. It's kind of sad to me that there's two very inward-looking people right now, and you might think that, yeah, the US gets screwed. I mean, think about NATO, and think about the fact that the US has to pay for all these military bases around the world that they definitely don't want to be paying for. It's definitely not that they're getting a good deal by putting their military bases on every continent and every place because they want to control the world that way. No, it's that the US is getting screwed. There's a billion examples of how people think this way, and in case you think like, oh yeah, well, how are we getting screwed on this one? The interesting thing is the United Convention of the Law on the Seas, the treaty that actually established the 200-mile radius, was signed by pretty much every country besides those in red. And obviously, Kazakhstan, they're landlocked. I mean, I don't know why they didn't sign it anyway, but sure. Obviously, like Uzbekistan, they're double landlocked. And, you know, there's a lot of countries that didn't sign it that are landlocked. And then the other weird examples are like Venezuela, Peru, Turkey. Okay, odd countries. But then guess what? Who also hasn't signed it? It's the United States of America. And the interesting thing about this is they haven't signed the treaty, which means they can make any claims they want to. They haven't, you know, limited their claims to being 200 miles. And this leads to the interesting situation where even though they legally, you know, basically can claim however small or big they want, they do claim the UN limit of 200 miles, but instead of it being enforced by international treaty, instead of it being law internationally, like if you intrude in their water, it would be a legal thing. No, there are no laws, you know, to back the US up if they choose to do that. Instead, the way it works is the US says, oh yeah, the way we'll defend our waters, the way we defend our area, which by the way is the second largest in the world, the sea control, the water, the area controlled by the United States, once you count the ocean around it, is actually the second largest of any country anywhere in the world. The way they control it is by being like, hey, you want to come in our, you know, in our exclusive economic zone? Give it a try, you know, give it a try. Yeah, that's you know, it's basically the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Marines, whatever else, are all on just the thing of like, yeah, if you want to try and take our stuff, feel free to try. And I kind of, again, a part of me likes that, and a part of me goes, sigh. Very American, right? Very American. But that is how it works. Every other country in the world that has signed this treaty are all covered by the same agreement that, like, yeah, the way it works is, you know, there are international laws and agreements, and the US says, come and take it. Yeah, MFers, I guess. I don't know if we're meant to swear on this channel, so I'll be careful just in case. So anyway, you know how I mentioned the US was the second largest country in terms of the amount of you know, area it controls. The list of top 5 countries by land area, everyone kind of vaguely knows, right? Like Russia is number 1, and then Canada is arguably number 2, or maybe you count the US, or maybe you count China. But Russia, China, America, Canada are 1 through 5, or 1 through 4, right? With 2 through 4 being disputed depending on who you are and what list you want to use. So sure, we won't count, because, you know, like internal waters are sort of, they're fully a part of a country. No other, again, the Hudson, the Canada has a lot of water that's a part of it, and it messes with the equations for a lot of things. And actually, I guess since we're mentioning it in this video, internal waters belong to a country. They choose who uses it and who doesn't, for economic reasons, for peaceful reasons, for again, war reasons, diplomacy reasons, etc., 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 which is actually one of the reasons why Canada wants to claim that, like, oh yeah, this is kind of internal water too. You gotta pay us if you want to use our sea, because related to a global warming video I want to make in the future. But anyway, so with that said, what are the largest countries once you count water? Because we know the US is number 2, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive, but kind of also makes some sense. Because Russia is in the top 5, but they're not number 1. You know who the largest country in the world is once you count the sea area? It's not the UK either, by the way. Again, I think they're number 5. The largest country in the world once you count sea area is France, because metropolitan France has a fair amount of sea. I mean, it's pretty big for a European country, given how close together they are and how much they usually have to share, sure. But then all of the territories that France owns, with Saint Pierre and Miquelon being a pretty sad exception for the most part, like, yeah, there's a big long strip because of how it's surrounded by Canada. French Guiana, like, sure, a little bit there. But then because of all of the islands that France owns that are surrounded by not much else, again, Clipperton Island and the French Polynesia, you know, Tahiti, etc., all of these islands together have a collective exclusive economic zone, which makes it the largest country in the world. France has a real advantage in terms of, I guess, you know, like the future of the world, in terms of finding oil, in terms of one day getting some huge amount of oil wealth. And the fact that it hasn't happened yet is kind of sad in my opinion. Like, the UK happened to find some in the North Sea, which happened to belong exclusively to them. You know, Norway found some in the North Sea as well, on the Norwegian Sea, I believe. But, you know, lots of countries have found oil in their tiny areas that do belong to them. There's even theories that, like, oh yeah, between Cyprus and Turkey, there could be some oil. Like, there's a lot of countries that have There's a lot of places like that, but France, with its huge exclusive economic zone, has still yet to find significant reserves enough to, like, again, make the country rich. And I want to see how that affects their relationship with their colonies once that does happen, because we already know New Caledonia secretly wants to leave. And yeah, basically, France is the largest country in the world, not predictably, and it can't use the power yet, but it's one of those things where, as time goes on, you've got to remember the humanity, again, the humanity can live pretty much anywhere on Earth pretty easily. I mean, even the ridiculously cold places, we managed to live. Even Antarctica, we managed to have settlements on. The sea is the one place we don't have permanent settlements yet, for lots of good reasons. We have a few oil rigs and stuff like that. But, you know, having human civilization work on the water is very tricky. That's why rising sea levels are such a problem, fun fact. But yeah, basically, the interesting thing this leads to is that the current situation in the world is that most of the world is unlivable, uninhabitable, by current standards. A thing that you could work on, again, if we want the future of humanity, I think moving to Mars, I think moving to space should be our clear future goal, but also 70% of the world right now is filled with just, oh yeah, we move between places using it. It's like a giant runway or a giant railway, except it works in every direction. A giant highway, I guess it kind of works as. We use the sea right now for fish, and we use it to send boats around to each other. And it's a huge lack of what could be doing under there, because right now we just use it to get dinosaur juice, which is the most valuable thing. There are many valuable minerals and stuff like that. Oh, wait, actually, here's the last thing I want to kind of point out. A lot of people think that the thing that's going to crash the gold, the platinum, the rare earth materials economy is going to be found in space when we can get to meteors. That's a whole thing. Think about the complexity of that compared to, oh yeah, think about your continental shelf. Think about this area. If you find some platinum, some gold, some whatever like that, rare materials, which we already know exist down there, it's going to be much easier to get those up to the surface. If we can make oil rigs, we can make platinum rigs, and I'm just saying, or realistically like gold rigs or something like that, but I'm just saying there's an interesting future below the waters for humanity, and maybe you agree, maybe you didn't, I don't know. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you to Wargaming for sponsoring it, and thank you to all of you for watching, because, as always, second channel, I care. Goodbye. Wait, consider subscribing. We're about to hit 100k.